Welcome back to part 4 of our 6-part series, Physician Contracting 101. In today's part, we will look at the buy-in provisions as well as professional liability insurance. What's significant about buy-in provisions? Typically, you will not see these provisions in an employment contract with a hospital or large physician group. Where you will typically see these types of provisions are in groups of 2 to perhaps 10 physicians. And what happens in those cases, in addition to the compensation you're receiving, you will actually have an opportunity to buy into the physician group and become part of the ownership of that physician group. What's key and instrumental in regard to the decisions concerning this is that you make sure you understand the stability of the physician group and how it actually operates. Typically, you will receive an employment agreement that outlines whether it will be automatic, whether you will be up for review after 3 or 5 or 7 years, and what actual qualifications or requirements you need to meet in order to be considered to become a partner or owner of the physician group. What's unusual about some of these situations, however, is that you never see the bylaws or the operating agreement or the partnership agreement to which you would be entering. When I advise my clients, I always like to make sure that they have those documents to review before they enter into the actual contract. Unfortunately, a lot of times physicians will enter employment agreements that have these types of provisions without having reviewed those documents, and then when it comes time to become an owner, they don't fully understand what that means or what they're going to have to do in order to become an owner, or what capital contribution they may have to make, or whether they have to buy into part of a building. I mention that because in these smaller physician groups, when you're going to become a partner, typically these physician groups may own a building. And it is important for you to understand whether you want to be part of that ownership of not only the practice, but of the building in which the practice actually operates. Sometimes this can be beneficial, but sometimes this can be a burden. Typically, what you need to make sure of is the location of the building and whether it has value standing on its own outside of the practice. In my experience, I have worked with some groups where their building is located right next to the hospital, and so long as the building is used as a physician group office, it will be fine and have value. But in the instance that the physicians would actually become employees of the hospital or work at the hospital or leave, the building itself, without having its ties to the hospital, actually does not have a great amount of value. And so you need to make sure that you understand what your buy-in is going to be in regard to the building, in regard to the practice, and what it means to be an owner. So when you are considering the buy-in provision and whether it's a positive or negative in your contract, there's a number of things you must consider. Similarly, a second important provision in the contract that we're going to look at today deals with the malpractice or professional liability insurance. Again, there are a number of things to consider when reviewing these types of provisions. The first is to look at whether the hospital is providing it or whether you need to. In almost all instances, the hospital will provide the coverage so long as you're working there. Question arises in regard to tail coverage, or after you've left the practice, who's going to pick up the insurance at that point? A number of times it can be negotiated and the hospital or your physician group will pick up the tail coverage. But many contracts today provide, unless negotiated differently, that the tail coverage will be provided and paid for by the physician upon their leaving. We need to make sure we understand what the contract requires and whether it's negotiable as to whether those terms can be changed. Similarly, you need to look at the limits of the malpractice insurance. Many limits today are at a $1 million occurrence and a $3 million sort of overall coverage, and that's typical. I've recently seen some contracts moving to a $2 million and a $4 million. Why is this important? Well, unfortunately, in today's world, many of the malpractice cases coming against doctors are for values higher than that. And so you need to look at whether you're sufficiently covered, whether your employer has additional coverage that's going to cover them, and if not, making sure that you have insurance that's going to provide protection for you against any and all malpractice cases. These are important provisions, and you must understand how they play into your contract. A lot of times these provisions may not be looked at that carefully because you're thinking about, I just want to start work, rather than how these play out. But again, you need to make sure you understand these. My warning to you today is go through these contracts, make sure your attorney explains them to you, and make sure you understand what you're buying into. Thank you for joining. I hope you join us again for part 5 of our series.